The house felt different at night. It wasn't that I was uncomfortable being alone. I had spent plenty of nights here by myself before. But there was something about the silence, the way it settled over everything like a heavy blanket, that made the rooms feel larger, emptier. My wife had left earlier in the afternoon to visit her parents, leaving me and the baby to our usual nighttime routine. Dinner, bath, bedtime, a sequence as familiar as breathing. The baby monitor rested on the nightstand, its soft glow cutting through the dim bedroom. The screen flickered faintly with static, a common glitch I had long since stopped worrying about. It happened sometimes, especially when the Wi-Fi was acting up. I reached for my phone, half-heartedly scrolling while keeping one eye on the monitor. My son lay in his crib, a small bundle wrapped snugly in a sleep sack, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythmic way that always made me feel a little more at peace. Static rippled across the screen again, distorting the image. I frowned, tapping the side of the monitor out of habit. The interference never lasted long. The screen steadied, the grainy black and white image of the nursery returning to normal. For a moment, everything was still. Then, movement. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something shifting in the room, cast by a passing car outside or the faint flicker of the night light plugged into the wall. But the shape in the corner didn't move like a shadow. It didn't stretch or shift with the light. It was solid, a hunched, misshapen figure crouched just beyond the crib's railing, still as death, watching. A sickening wave of cold washed over me, a primal instinct waking something sharp and raw inside my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the camera. It only stared. The screen flickered again. For a heartbeat, the nursery was empty, just the crib, the rocking chair, the soft glow of the nightlight. Then, the static cleared, and the figure was back. No, not back. Closer. The gaunt face pressed nearer to the crib, a hollow-eyed thing barely distinguishable from the shadows, except for the faint glint of something. Teeth? The image warped again, distorting into chaotic streaks of black and white. I was on my feet before I fully registered moving. The hall seemed impossibly long as I stumbled toward the nursery, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. I barely noticed my own breath, ragged and uneven, as I reached the door. The knob turned easily. No resistance. Inside, the room was exactly as I had left it. The crib stood against the far wall, the soft blue blanket tucked neatly over my sleeping son. The night light cast its dim glow over the space, painting the furniture in long, curved shadows. The rocking chair remained still. The closet door hung slightly ajar, just as it had been before. Empty. I stood there, breath catching in my throat, scanning every inch of the small nursery. The air was still, untouched, as if nothing had disturbed it in hours. I moved closer to the crib, reaching down with shaking hands to brush my fingers over my son's warm forehead. He stirred slightly, but didn't wake. My pulse, still hammering in my ears, slowed just a fraction. No one was here. I turned, scanning the room again, searching for any sign, any proof that what I had seen was real. But there was nothing, just the soft hum of the white noise machine and the distant creaks of the house settling. Still, the uneasy weight in my chest refused to lift. I forced myself to step back, glancing at the baby monitor in my hand. The screen showed the same peaceful image as before. The crib, the blanket, the faint rise and fall of tiny breaths. The corner of the room was empty. No figure, no eyes watching from the dark. A glitch, I told myself. A trick of the light. Still, I hesitated as I left the room, pausing just long enough to push the nursery door shut behind me. Morning arrived without warning. I wasn't sure when I had fallen asleep, but I woke to an unnatural quiet that settled over the house like a thick fog. Usually by this time, the baby would be stirring, his soft fussing filtering through the monitor, calling for me in his small, breathy whimpers. But there was nothing, not even the rustling of blankets, not the creak of the crib shifting with movement. Just silence. I sat up too quickly, my head spinning from the sudden rush of blood, but the unease in my gut had already begun to take root. The monitor. I always check the monitor first. It should have been there, right where I had left it on the nightstand. It wasn't. The space next to the lamp was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I searched the blankets, the floor beside the bed, even the edge of the dresser where I might have absent-mindedly placed it before sleep. Nothing. It wasn't there. A sour panic curled in my stomach as I threw the covers off and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My feet hit the hardwood, and I forced myself to steady my breath. Maybe I had taken it with me when I checked on the baby last night. Maybe I had left it in the nursery. The hallway was dim in the early light. Shadows stretched long against the walls. Each step toward the nursery felt heavier, a growing weight pressing into my chest, my limbs moving slower than they should have. The knob turned easily under my hand, and I pushed the door open, heart hammering against my ribs. The crib was empty. It took me longer than it should have to understand what I was seeing. The blue blanket was still tucked neatly in place, the small pillow undisturbed. The crib looked as it always had, pristine, carefully arranged. But there was no baby, no small form curled beneath the fabric, no tiny fingers grasping at the edges of sleep. Just emptiness. The breath left my lungs in a sharp rush, and my hands gripped the railing of the crib as if steadying myself against something that couldn't be real. My eyes darted around the room, searching for some explanation, some sign that I was still dreaming. The windows were closed, the curtains untouched. The door had been shut when I arrived. There was no way, no possible way, anyone could have entered without my knowing. But he wasn't here. A sickening heat flushed through my body, my skin prickling cold despite the warmth rising to my face. I stumbled back, my movements frantic now, tearing through the nursery with shaking hands. The closet door swung open with a dull creak, revealing the neatly arranged rows of tiny clothes, the bin of toys stacked on the shelf. Nothing. I dropped to my knees, peering beneath the crib, my fingers pressing against the wooden floorboards. Nothing. My mind clawed for logic, for rational thought, but all I could hear was the roaring of blood in my ears. The baby monitor. If I could find the monitor, I could check the footage, I could see, but it was gone. The realization hit me like a stone to the chest. The monitor was missing. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to think. It wasn't beside my bed. It wasn't in the nursery. But I had used it last night. I had watched the crib, seen him sleeping there, seen. The memory of the figure in the corner surfaced like something dark and rotting, rising from deep water. The way it had lingered, unmoving. The way the static had flickered just long enough to make me doubt my own eyes. No, it wasn't real. It hadn't been real. But the baby was gone. I staggered to my feet, legs unsteady, and tore through the house. The living room, the kitchen, every room in between. I checked behind furniture, beneath tables, in closets that were too small to hide anything more than folded linens. My hands fumbled with the locks on the doors, testing each one. Secure. Unmoved. The windows, latched and locked. There was no sign of forced entry. No way in. No way out. As if he had never been here at all. The thought clawed its way into my mind, unwelcome but persistent. I turned back toward the nursery, my breath shallow, hands trembling at my sides. Something was wrong. Not just with the house, not just with the missing baby, but with the room itself. The air inside felt heavier, thicker, as though the space had subtly compressed overnight. The walls, had they always been that close together? The crib seemed nearer to the opposite side of the room. The rocking chair pushed unnaturally close to the dresser. It was as if the room had shrunk. I ran a hand along the nearest wall, the plaster cool beneath my fingertips. The dimensions felt wrong. Imperceptibly so, but enough that my body registered it before my mind could fully grasp the implications. I swallowed hard, fighting against the frantic, spiraling thoughts in my head. I needed to think. I needed to act. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me back into the present, and I forced myself to breathe, to steady my hands enough to pull it free. My wife's name on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. How could I tell her? How could I possibly explain that our baby, our son, had vanished from a locked room in the middle of the night? That I had no answers, no rational explanation. Only the gut-wrenching terror that something else had been in the nursery last night. That maybe, just maybe, it had taken him. I pressed the phone to my ear, swallowing the rising panic in my throat, forcing my voice into something steady. Normal. She couldn't know. Not yet. Not until I found him. Not until I figured out what was happening to this house. The nursery was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Standing in the doorway, I tried to convince myself that it was just the panic clouding my senses, making everything seem unnatural, but no amount of rational thought could erase the quiet certainty pressing down on me. The dimensions of the room felt subtly warped, like the walls had crept inward while I wasn't looking. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen. The crib sat pristine and untouched, a cruel mockery of the truth. My son had never climbed out of that crib. No one had entered the room. No doors had opened. No windows had been unlatched. And yet he was gone. I forced myself to move, to act, before the crushing weight of my thoughts swallowed me whole. My hands were trembling as I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the baby monitor app. I needed to see it. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The app loaded, pulling up the recorded footage from last night. A timeline stretched across the bottom of the screen, each tiny mark indicating movement or sound. I scrolled back, heart hammering against my ribs. The crib was full. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. The grainy black and white image showed my son lying still, wrapped snug in his blanket, his small form rising and falling in deep sleep. I exhaled shakily. At least there was proof. Then the static flickered. A brief disruption, nothing more than a second's worth of visual noise. But when the feed returned, the crib was empty. The timestamp hadn't changed. I stared at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. There was no transition, no movement, no sign of what had happened. 1 second he had been there. The next he was gone. No distortion, no flicker of someone stepping into frame. Just nothing. I scrubbed through the footage, my fingers moving faster, more frantic. The timeline made no sense. The app had recorded normally up until 2:13 a.m., then static, then nothing. A gap. No more recordings for the rest of the night. Like the room had ceased to exist. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My mouth was dry, my fingers cold against the smooth glass of my phone. I needed another angle. The house security cameras. I switched apps, pulling up the feed from the night before. The front door, the back door, the stairwell. Each camera had recorded as expected. Timestamps intact, footage clean. I scrolled to the nursery cam, the one positioned just outside the door, angled slightly toward the hallway. The footage played normally for most of the night. The house was still undisturbed. Then, around 2 a.m., the recording jittered, a split-second flicker of interference. I felt my pulse spike. The timeline jumped. The timestamp leapt from 2:12 a.m. to 4:47 a.m. in an instant. 2.5 hours gone. No missing frames. No gradual shift. Just a clean cut, like those hours had been sliced out of existence. The nursery door never opened. No one went in. No one came out. My stomach clenched with something primal, something I wasn't prepared to name. A buzz from my phone made me flinch. A message. My wife. I swiped it open with stiff fingers, my breath shuddering in my throat. She had a nightmare. She dreamed she had come home and the baby was gone. That she searched the house and found no trace of him, no memory that he had ever existed. That no one believed her. My blood ran cold. I looked up from the screen, my gaze drawn back to the empty crib. The silence in the room stretched, pressing against my ears, filling the space with something thick and cloying. Something had erased him. Not just taken. Erased. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, my hands tightening into fists. I needed to find the baby monitor. If it was missing from the bedroom, from the nursery, then it had to be somewhere. It had to be here. I tore through the house again, pulling open drawers, digging through cabinets. The couch cushions, the bathroom, the kitchen counter where I sometimes left it by accident. Nothing. Then I remembered the attic. We had stored old baby supplies up there, hand-me-downs from family, toys we had yet to use. It wasn't a place I visited often, but if the monitor had somehow ended up there, the pull-down ladder groaned as I unfolded it, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was cramped, filled with stacks of boxes and discarded furniture. A faint mustiness clung to the air, thick with the scent of dust and old wood. I picked my way through the clutter, stepping over old blankets and plastic bins. My pulse quickened with each movement, my senses sharp, searching. Then I saw it. Tucked between two boxes near the far wall, screen cracked, was the baby monitor. It shouldn't be here. I hadn't brought it up here. No one had. I knelt, my fingers hovering over the device. The casing was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been sitting in a freezer instead of an attic. I turned it over. The power light blinked. Still on. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow. The screen was damaged, the glass fractured in thin, jagged lines, but the display still flickered with static. For a moment, I hesitated. I didn't want to see what was on it, but I had to. I pressed the playback button. The screen flickered, struggling to load. The distorted shapes of a nursery came into focus, warped through the cracks in the display. The crib, the nightlight, the shadows curling in the corners of the room. Then, movement, not from the crib, from the walls. The shadows pulled inward, stretching, folding, something shifting within them. The crib remained still, untouched, but the darkness around it moved. A shape. No, a presence, unfurled from the edges of the room, its form indistinct, fluid, as though it existed just beyond the reach of reality. The static on the screen deepened, warping the image further. Then suddenly, the crib was empty. The figures gone. The screen cut to black. A deep, suffocating silence filled the attic. I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and uneven, hammering against my ribs. This wasn't a kidnapping. This wasn't someone breaking in, taking him away. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain. Something that had taken him without ever opening a door. I didn't leave the attic right away. The baby monitor, cracked and humming with static, still sat in my hands, its screen dark now, as if whatever had played back had drained the last of its energy. I stared at it, breathing heavily, my skin crawling with the feeling that something was watching me from the dim corners of the attic. Something had taken my son. Not someone. Something. I turned the monitor over in my hands, half expecting it to feel warm, pulsing with the residual energy of whatever unnatural thing had passed through it. But it was cold. Unnaturally cold, as though it had been sitting in ice. That didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I needed answers. I made my way downstairs on unsteady legs, every shadow along the walls feeling too deep, too stretched, as if the house itself was shifting around me. The nursery door remained shut. I refused to look at it as I passed. Instead, I went to my laptop. I hadn't searched the house's history since we moved in. There had been no reason to. We bought it new, or so I'd thought, but I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I pulled up the real estate listing, scrolling through the photos taken before we had moved in. My pulse slowed slightly at the familiar images, the living room, the kitchen, the staircase leading up to the bedrooms. But then I reached the photos of the second floor. Something was wrong. There were pictures of the master bedroom, the guest room, but no nursery. The hallway ended in a blank wall. No door, no crib, no space where the nursery should have been. I scrolled back, my hands shaking, searching for some indication that I had made a mistake. But the evidence was clear. In the listing, in the blueprint attached to the sale, the nursery had never existed. I slammed the laptop shut, nausea rolling through me. The room was there now. I had painted it, decorated it. I had spent months assembling the crib, arranging the bookshelves, rocking my son to sleep in the chair by the window. Hadn't I? I pushed back from the desk, gripping the edges until my knuckles turned white. Maybe the listing had been old. Maybe they had remodeled the house after the photos were taken. Maybe, but I didn't believe that. Not really. I needed to go deeper. I opened my laptop again, this time searching for archived records. City permits, housing developments, anything that could explain the discrepancy. The search results pulled up dozens of listings, but my eyes locked onto one immediately, a police report. My stomach twisted into knots as I clicked on it. The report was from 30 years ago. My address was listed, but the house wasn't described as it was now. It had been smaller then, The nursery, just an empty space, an addition that had yet to be built. But that wasn't what made my skin crawl. The report described an infant disappearance. A baby, only 6 months old, had vanished from the home. No forced entry, no broken locks, no signs of struggle. The crib had been empty when the parents woke in the morning. Just like my son, the case had been closed due to lack of evidence. No leads, no suspects. The child had simply ceased to exist. I felt the world around me tilt slightly, as if the floor beneath my feet had shifted. The house, the room. It wasn't just my son who had disappeared. This had happened before. I kept searching, each page bringing another wave of suffocating dread. I found the public property records, documents listing the history of the land. The house hadn't been built over another home. It had been built over nothing. An empty plot, no prior structures, no previous foundation, just an open piece of land, untouched until someone decided to build a house here. But that wasn't possible. There had been an infant living here before the nursery was even added. The walls of that space hadn't existed yet, and yet a baby had vanished from them. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. My pulse thundered in my ears. The nursery hadn't always been here. It had been added later, and now it was taking children. I turned slowly toward the hallway, toward the closed door of the nursery. The house was silent, the air thick with something unseen. I could feel it now, the weight of it pressing against the walls, the wrongness embedded in the structure. The room hadn't always been a part of this house. It had been attached like a parasite, like something that didn't belong. And it had taken my son, not stolen, consumed. A thought surfaced, unbidden, sinking deep into my bones. The nursery didn't exist before, and soon it wouldn't exist again. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the nursery pressed in around me, the air thick with the scent of dust and something foul, something rotting just beneath the surface. The baby was gone. The monitor was broken. The records all pointed to something that shouldn't be possible. But the room remained, and I could feel it watching me. I had spent the past hours staring at the blank walls, my mind circling the same impossible realization. This nursery was never supposed to exist. It had been added to the house, but not built, not constructed. It had been attached, and now it was closing in. I stepped forward, my fingers grazing the wallpaper. The design was something my wife had picked out, a soft blue with little clouds, cheerful, innocent. But as I pressed my palm flat against it, a sharp coldness spread through my fingertips, as if the surface was leaching the warmth from my skin. It didn't feel like a wall. It felt like skin stretched too thin. A low hum filled my ears, just at the edge of hearing. Static, faint, but unmistakable. The baby monitor. I whirled around. The broken device still sat on the floor where I had left it, its screen dark, its casing cracked. But the static was coming from it. A low, pulsing distortion, flickering between silence and something else. I picked it up with shaking hands. The screen flickered to life. The nursery, the crib was there, the blanket tucked in perfectly. But I wasn't alone in the room. A shape stood in the corner, just beyond the nightlight's glow. Gaunt, impossibly thin, its hollow eyes reflecting back at me. It was staring directly into the camera. I swallowed, unable to look away. The static deepened, the image distorting. Then the figure moved. Not fast, not in a sudden jolt. It simply stepped forward. The crib was empty. The figure had been inside it. I threw the monitor to the ground. The screen shattered, but the sound didn't stop. The static deepened, as if it was coming from the very walls of the nursery. And then, a cry, muffled, distant, coming from inside the wall. I turned toward the crib, pulse hammering against my ribs. The soft wail echoed again, barely more than a whisper. It wasn't coming from the hallway, not outside the room. It was coming from inside the nursery itself. I moved without thinking, ripping at the wallpaper with frantic hands. The fabric tore easily, peeling back in long strips. Beneath it, instead of smooth drywall, the surface was rough, splintered. Not insulation, not modern construction, rotting wood. The house wasn't built with this. It shouldn't be here. I kept tearing, my breath coming fast and uneven. Beneath the layers of wallpaper and paint, Something dark and warped revealed itself. Old beams, thick with scratches. Long, uneven marks. Not from something trying to get in, from something trying to get out. A sharp pain splintered through my fingers as I clawed at the wood, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The cry came again. Closer now. The wood groaned under my weight as I dug my nails in, splinters embedding beneath my skin. A piece of the beam cracked, and a sliver of darkness peered through. Not insulation, not the framework of a house. A void, a space that shouldn't exist. I tore harder, yanking chunks of rotten wood away until the opening was wide enough to see inside. Blackness, a deep, stretching nothingness, curling in on itself like smoke. Then, movement, not from inside the void, from behind me. I turned, my breath frozen in my throat. The crib was gone. The walls had shifted, the furniture, all of it, vanishing as if it had never been here. The nursery was collapsing inward, folding into itself. A whisper drifted from the hole in the wall. My own voice, but wrong, stretched, warped. You were never supposed to have him. The darkness surged forward. Everything went black. I woke up in the nursery. The air was still, empty. The room was quiet. I sat up slowly, the floor beneath me cold and unfamiliar. My hands ached, my fingers raw, but the wall in front of me was untouched, smooth, freshly painted. The crib was gone. The rocking chair, the bookshelf, the blankets, all of it. The nursery was just an empty room. No decorations, no baby monitor, no sign that a child had ever slept here. My breath hitched. My pulse drummed in my ears. I stumbled to my feet, shoving open the door. The house was exactly as it had been the night before. The same furniture, the same framed photos on the walls. Except the photos. I grabbed the nearest frame, my fingers shaking. A picture of my wife and me standing in front of the house on the day we moved in. The frame next to it, our wedding photo. The one after that, a vacation in the mountains. No baby, no crib in the background, no tiny hand clutching my shirt. Nothing. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I scrolled through the camera roll. The pictures were still there. The ones of the nursery, of the baby, until they weren't. I watched as the images glitched, flickered, and disappeared. One by one, my stomach lurched. A car door slammed outside. My wife. I turned, running to the front door as she stepped inside, setting down her bags. She looked at me, her face blank, eyes hollow. I opened my mouth, words caught in my throat. She walked past me, barely glancing at the nursery door. Like it wasn't there, like it had never been there. I forced myself to speak, my voice weak, broken. I asked about the baby. Her expression didn't change. She blinked at me, her face tightening slightly. A small, puzzled frown. Then, confusion, as if she had never heard the name before. What son?